Hello, I'm Gina Fitt, and you've either surfed to or purposely selected Live Talk with Vern Moses. Welcome to another in our series of ongoing verbal essays brought to you in this television format. It's great to have you with us today. Vern, last week we were talking about bereavement, and at the end of the show you mentioned that sometimes we get stuck in a place where it's a bottleneck, and we're not able to go on and be productive in our lives, in our relationships, in our careers, because we're stuck and we're not able to get over the grieving that we need to for a loss. And we defined a number of different types of losses, and also lacks, or there's not enough of something.
Yeah, very briefly, we can quickly do a review. The fact that in bereavement you have two primary reasons, losses and lacks. The losses were obviously death and divorce, separation, job or business, relocation, families moving around, and then lost expectations. Those unfulfilled dreams can really be painful to some people, and they just stop their whole life. Sometimes it can be a combination of these things too, and perhaps we'll have a chance to get into that. But even a recognized lack, things can go along fine. We don't even know we're poor, until somehow something happens, and all of a sudden we get conscious of what we don't have, whether it be education, money, support, whatever it happens to be. And what we were talking about is that out of this can come what I've referred to as bottlenecks of bereavement. And I'm going to go over here. I did another bottleneck. What did I do? Here we go. A bottleneck, as you know, is a bottleneck. But a bottleneck can also be something that gets stuck in the way that prohibits things from flowing properly. For example, every office might have a bottleneck. Everything goes fine until it reaches old Charlie, and everything bogs down. He's called a bottleneck.
Right.
Or maybe a log jam. A log gets stuck just the wrong way and it causes a log jam, and that's called a bottleneck. Bottlenecks of bereavement. It starts out, and some of these are pretty common. Denial certainly would be a bottleneck of bereavement. Typically, too, there can be anger, a lot of anger. And I'm going to go back over these in just a moment to explain some of them. But denial and anger, guilt can cause a lot of problems, keeping people from moving on, letting things be the way they are. But denial, anger, guilt, negotiations. It's to the point of the irrational sometimes, how we can negotiate for things to be the way they used to be. And then, of course, one that's not often mentioned is a tendency for the mind to transfer, or I'm going to think of it as transference. Now, these can be the bottlenecks of bereavement. In other words, what I'm saying is that when the news hits us that something is dramatically different all of a sudden, denial is probably one of the first things that can sneak in there. Now, if it gets stuck right here, say for example, on its way through, if it gets stuck here, what also may get stuck inside of us?
All the other things.
Anger, the guilt, the tendency to negotiate, and the capacity to transfer. If denial sneaks on through, anger may get stuck. That gets on through, there may be some residue guilt. But all of these are potential bottlenecks of bereavement.
I understand.
Let's examine some of these things. Denial, what does that mean? Well, it starts out with language. The police officer standing on the doorstep, identifying us very carefully and tells us that our spouse has been killed in a car wreck. The tendency is to say, no, you're mistaken. I just talked to him on the phone. This is not right. This is what you're doing is inappropriate. You guys ought to be more careful. Strong denial. It can happen in hospitals. Doctors don't like to come out and hear it. Now that's fairly typical, that fleeting moment when you don't want anything to change. However, this can get real serious. Having been in the industry, I've been in lots of homes, too many frankly, where perhaps they lost a baby 8, 10, 12 years ago, a little girl perhaps, say 6 years old. And that room is exactly the way it was the day she died. Little dresses hanging in the closet, pillows on the couch, and toys and what have you. And they talk about a memorial and what have you, but in truth, I really believe that at some level they're waiting for the little girl to come home. There's no question there's a denial there. I remembered too how impactful this can be. I remember my mother years ago, I used to wonder about her sanity when she told about how one day she was preparing lunch, like she had so many other days in the past, and she looked up out the kitchen window and she saw her granddaddy coming across the hayfield like he had practically every day of her life, and he'd been dead for like 3 months. And she says, I know I saw him, but she ran out and out through the screen door and it slammed behind her. You know that sound of the slamming screen door? You know what I mean? And she
Yes.
says, Granddaddy. And there wasn't anybody there. And she said, Bernard, I know he was there. And to her, she was. She wasn't dreaming. I mean, this is the capacity of the mind to create that. The need is so great. Yeah, it's kind of like, I have a friend, Stephen, who has instructed a lot of scuba divers. And he says, now, if you're going to go spelunking, go into these dark caves, you got to remember one thing. That if your light goes out, if that light goes out, remember, you cannot see. Okay, and they keep telling him that over and over again. If your light goes out, before you can replace it, remember, you cannot see. Now, why do they hammer that? Because the tendency is for them to see. In other words, in that moment of panic, you know what I mean? They'll see big gaping mouths and what have you, anything at all that the subconscious mind can create to get them out of there. It's really fast. And if they succumb, if they panic, a lot of them will die right there. Yeah. Delightful story. I have a friend, Dick Brinton, who told me about one time he was freshwater snorkel diving, no tank. And he was down about, let's say this is the water level, and he was down under a ledge evidently with his snorkel, and his fins or flippers hit the muck that was above him, and this residue just totally encompassed him. He couldn't see his hand that close to his face. And I mean, no air and total disorientation. You can't tell up, down, sideways, or whatever. And he said he was just to that point, a point that I have been to at one time in my life in a quarry dive that I did. But he was to that point where he felt I could just sip a little water and get a little air, I can make it. Dangerous point, because when you take that sip is when you drown. And but anyway, at that moment, he said, he saw this beautiful, beautiful bass, huge bass swim right in front of him. You know what I mean? And he followed the bass, and he broke through the silt and surfaced. There was no bass, you know what I mean? But his mind created that. Evidently, there was a little piece of the mind that wanted it there, and it created it. We have a capacity for this. Very, very powerful. I'll tell you a way of testing denial. This is kind of fascinating. You can go to the obituary column and say tomorrow, any of our listeners can try this. If they think that, well, I'm too sophisticated for this, it's not going to happen to me. Go to the obituary columns and find someone who's receiving visitors. What that means is the body has been prepared for viewing. Family and friends are invited to come by and pay their respects, usually we call it. Okay? Total stranger. Walk into the funeral home and say, the Harrison's place. And they'll say, right this way. And they'll show you to a room that's probably empty, except for the body lying in repose. Probably empty. Shouldn't be. We'll talk about that later, but it'll be there by itself. You walk up to the casket and just stand there. Okay? And if you're real quiet and look down, that body will move. As the diaphragm will pump up and down, a finger will twitch, a nostril will flare, the eye will roll under the lid like people are sleeping. You ever see the eye go under the lid? There's movement, there's no question. Now there's not, but the mind, in its desire to deny this reality, will create movement. But the longer you stay there, after a while the diaphragm will stop moving, but then you'll see the finger twitch. You look at the finger over here and it won't move, but you'll see the diaphragm. And pretty soon it's the peripheral that'll continue holding on to the movement. But if you stay long enough, that'll all stop. Now, can you imagine if that was your baby? Your sweetheart that was there? Would there be movement? Oh, a lot of it. And this is an essential thing. Confrontation is the key to peace in this area. Because if you stand there long enough, the movement stops, denial has been managed, and then there's going to be an overwhelming desire to touch, to kiss a brow. This is as normal as breathing, as blinking an eye to wet it. These are normal things to happen because that certifies the death, which has to be acknowledged in order for there to be no denial at all. Again, we'll come back to this. Denial. Anger. Anger at what? Anger at the person for dying. Quite common. Had a lady in Lancaster, Pennsylvania who admitted that for nearly 2 years after her husband died and his lazy boy watching television while she was fixing dinner one night. You know, she fixed dinner, put it on the table, he didn't budge. And she said, well, I mean, dinner, and he didn't move. And she went over to him to give him some fuss, you know what I mean, because you're supposed to come to the dinner table. And he would never come to the dinner table again. In other words, he had died without crying out for help. His eyes were open, but he had just ceased to exist. And she wasn't prepared for that, much too soon. And for nearly 2 years after that, when she was preparing dinner, oftentimes she would grab scissors or a butcher knife and attack the chair. And she would say some nasty things as she stabbed and slashed it and saying, you dirty name, you didn't even say goodbye. Yeah, she was really upset with him for dying. Or angry at God for taking him. How many times have we heard, well, if that's the kind of God there is, I want nothing to do with him. Now, it's pretty hard to reject a God that you believe in. I mean, you're talking about pain now, okay? But that's not at all uncommon. Angry at other women for still having their husbands. Angry at this child for still being alive when this one isn't. That's pretty irrational, but it's not uncommon. Anger. Guilt. Oh my. Why didn't I make her take that mammogram? Why did I feed him the bacon and the eggs that he wanted? Why did I let him buy that motorcycle? Why didn't I make that phone call when he called when he did? Because if I had of, or if I'd have been there. You know what I mean? A lot of guilt that gets, and really a lot of that is anger turned inward. And surely I should have been able to do something, and now it's too late. Negotiate. Please, God, don't let them die. Or even after they're gone, please, God, bring them back. Let me have them, okay? One of the most classic cases I've ever seen of this was on television one night. It was, I think it was 2020 or maybe 60 Minutes. This was years ago. They were doing a feature on drunken driving, and they had elected a policewoman to be a spokesperson about this. And the reason they'd chosen her is that her husband, a policeman, had been killed by a young drunken driver. He had stopped someone for a ticket, and a young drunken person had driven into them and killed him. And let me tell you, in her talking about it on television, there was still a lot of first-party commentary. I mean, you could tell she was still in denial. And as she was talking, you could see the throat thicken, the anger begin to emerge. I would not have wanted to have been stopped by that lady if I'd been drinking.
Yes.
I mean, she was dangerous. I mean, just one false move, one false word, and that police officer could have been inappropriate. She had some very strong feelings about what should happen to drunken drivers, including corporal and capital punishment. And I had a sense that she might take it upon herself if you crossed swords with her too severely. There was a lot of anger there. Oh, and guilt. If I'd have been in my regular squad car that I was normally assigned to, rather than having taken another assignment, I would have been on site, and I think I probably could have prevented it. I was still there. And then, in front of everyone. How many people watched 2020 or 60 Minutes? Millions of people. By then, she was real thick-throated, and she says, I still pray to God to get my husband back, even if he has to take my babies. This is long. This is a couple of years.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, even she probably was startled when she saw it. Yeah, this stuff can get really serious, and it can be durable a long, long, long time. Denial, anger, guilt, negotiate, and then there's transference. The mind's capacity to take the duties, roles, and responsibilities of this person and put them over on this one. Like a husband dies, and the son gets all the decision-making authorities and what have you. And it can go all the way into the sexual arenas. This is not an excuse. It doesn't justify. But I'm totally convinced that a lot of incest that we hear about is because of a bereavement. In other words, the marriage didn't work, or there's been a death, or there's been a lost expectation, okay, and there's a piece of the mind that transfers the duties and the roles and responsibility of the spouse over to the child. This is both men and women. It can go in that direction. This is not uncommon. In our history, way back, even some of the cultures, the brother had to marry the widow. Perhaps you've heard about that, and we've gone past that now. But certainly these are major, major things. Now, we have to figure, well, we got to get them out. See, what are these? These are all products of fear.
Right.
It's all products of fear. And so, and that causes all kinds of inappropriate behavior, inappropriate feelings, and this type of thing. And so the challenge is, how do we break, how do we shatter that bottleneck so that these things can flow out normally and freely, and that individual, the bereaved, can go on with their lives as the deceased would want them to. Don't you think? Really. What's this about? It's about grief. This is the key that does it. Now, isn't this interesting that we're putting this on the other side? You look in the dictionary, you're not going to get supported with this. But I believe with all my heart and soul that what we've done here is to take these two words and intermingle them inappropriately. I've heard bereavement and grief used interchangeably all my life. Haven't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, what we're contending is this, that bereavement is somewhat of an adjective, okay, that describes a state of being, okay, emanating from fear. Okay? Grief is a dichotomy. Grief is a solution. And it can be considered in all cases, in all of its forms, as a verb. That was, it's an action word based on love. And this is a solution to this.
So there's a process that we go through.
Now, what is grief? What's that about? Well, ideally, at a death or some major separation or what have you, ideally would be the wail. Now, you can imagine how we handle that in this society. Someone starts to wail. That's what I did, okay? And I had to escape it. It was too painful. Too painful to watch, too painful to do, too painful to be around. And so we exit.
It's considered inappropriate.
Yeah. The wail. Now, what this is about is that when we wail, there's a detoxification process. When you go into bereavement, and toxins are spewing into your brain and bloodstream out of that fear. Okay, Mortito. Remember we talked about Mortito some weeks ago? That kicks in, and boy, we want out, we want to join, we want to go, we want to get away from the pain. And so the wail is the counter to that. The wail detoxifies and cleans up the mind and heart. And usually that's accompanied conveniently with convulsions, which are very painful, no question, convulsions. It's the involuntary contraction and extension of muscles, and what's happening is that it's spewing out toxins, spilling them into the bloodstream so they can be eliminated. Okay, very healthy. Some cultures have the good sense to hire wailers, and they come and wail so that the people who need to can without being embarrassed. It's a love act, you know, and we need to take a look at this. Now, if you wail and there's convulsions, can you see there's a therapeutic, cathartic value in that, this forward movement. However, even at that, as you move on to keening, as a next logical step, keening. Keening, or we could call it even shuddering, would accompany that. Are you familiar with the word keening?
No, I'm not. That's a new one for me, Bern.
Keening is practiced by some Irish Catholics, some black communities still do it, and some people, when it occurs, they stifle it. But keening is where family and friends and what have you will come to be with the body, with the family, and keening sounds something like it's that grinding kind of a thing. It would be sort of sub-wail, and yet it has a real cathartic value. And then, of course, there's usually a lot of shuddering going on, which is just another step down from the convulsions. Healthy, healthy, healthy. Now, if you don't do this, can you see where you might need more of this?
Right.
But we're not getting either one in a lot of our society. We're not getting either one. What happens on the next step down would be sobbing, crying. We could put those together. You know, that sobbing is that wrenching kind of body thing. Sobbing. And let's put crying right parallel to it. Crying. You know, they found toxins. In other words, I forget the name of the technology that does it, but they have found toxins in tears of grief that are not in tears of joy.
Really?
Which is evidence that the body really is depoisoning, if you would, or clearing itself up.
That's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, really interesting. But sobbing and crying, usually with some shaking going on. In other words, if you've been around a funeral, around death very much, you see a lot of hands shaking and stuff. And this, again, is a detoxifying process. Once again, if you haven't wailed, no keening, how long can this go on?
Years.
A long, long time, yeah. After that, there's weeping. Weeping. The eye filling and perhaps brimming with tear and caught just in time before it runs down. It's kind of a way of, we think of letting the griefs or the pain seep out a little bit at a time so no one will notice. And then we apologize for it too, don't we? So, I'm sorry. What a tragedy. What a tragedy. Weeping and chattering goes with this. Chattering. Talking incessantly about the loved one, usually deifying them, making them much better than they ever were. I know my mother for 18 years wept and chattered about my father. I never allowed a swain or a courtier to come into her life because she just would never let Albert go. And she made him into this wonder man. And frankly, I used to wonder sometimes, well, Mother, if he was so wonderful, why didn't you treat him that way when he was alive? But I never said anything. But she wept and she chatted for years, chattering. Again, this can go on for a long time. With my mother, it was 18 years. None of this was handled. None of this was handled. And then one that's very important that we've got to understand is laughter. This is a grief process, laughter. And it's very important to understand this one. I've been in some counseling rooms where the family was there making the final arrangements. Say Daddy was down the hall being prepared for viewing. Mom was there, maybe a sister, a couple children. And a lot of inappropriate behavior. I have seen such inappropriate behavior. I mean, yelling, shoving matches, nearly fistfights over minor issues like whether Dad should have his glasses on in the casket or not, or how much they were going to spend, or what to wear, who was going to get the wedding ring. You know, I mean, just not prepared for this at all. But once in a while, I'd say about 50% of the time, someone in the room will go, you know, and you hear it, and you wonder what's going to happen next, and you go on for a little bit while longer, and pretty soon that person is going, you notice that? And then one or two things will happen. The family will turn on him like a snake. You son of a, you know, they'll swear at him and say, how dare you, Daddy's down the hall, he loved us, gave his life for us, you know. And of course he gets into a gale of laughter and into big trouble. Fortunately, once in a while what happens? It's contagious. It's contagious. And everybody's in a gale of laughter, remembering the wonderful and the funny things that might have happened in their lives together. This is very, very healthy. This is very healthy. And it's most common at funerals. And yet people try to stifle it because they're afraid of being misunderstood. What we're saying is that more of us need to understand this. It's never too soon or too late to understand bereavement and grief and how to do it effectively and what to allow. For example, you remember a while ago I said that my uncle came up out of the woods, was having a terrible time, where in truth he was what?
He was going
having a
through the
wonderful
grieving
time.
process,
He was having a wonderful time because he recuperated and went on with his life perhaps better than my mother or I did.
Yeah.
I'm sure 28 years later he didn't have a difficulty that I had because he was managing it. His body was taking care of itself. His mind was relieving itself at that point in time. Pretty exciting. Pretty exciting. This is essential. I mean, these things need to be done. What's the alternatives? We need to stay with alternatives just for a minute. I have one of the reasons I talk about this in our series, our live series that we do, and also here, is some of the things that I've seen. For example, in 1980, a fellow by the name of Jerry, we'll just call him Jerry, came into the environment. We were in the funeral business still, and he'd been a practicing attorney, unhappily so, and wanted to leave the adversarial environment and perhaps render a service, make a contribution in the funeral industry. And he, good looking, well educated, articulate, well groomed, knew the product, knew the script, knew the program, knew the competition, never did anything. Never did anything. 4 or 5, 6, 7 weeks, to the point where it was like, Jerry, you need to move on with your life or something. One day we were sitting talking, and I said, Jerry, let me ask you, because I'd seen this happen before, and frankly, it had happened for me. I said, have you lost someone in your life, perhaps, that would cause you to be here, maybe looking for answers? And they always look at you like, how did you know? They always have that look. And I said, have you? He said, well, yeah. I said, well, if you don't mind, Jerry, who was it? It was my daddy. Now, here's a 47-year-old attorney, okay, saying my daddy. What would you expect to hear? My father, you know? Yeah. And I thought, oh, boy. I said, Jerry, how did your daddy die? I picked up the vernacular. And he said, well, I was told he had cancer. Again, that didn't make any sense. So I said, Jerry, how long ago did this happen? When I was 3. I mean, here he was, way up in here, 47 years old. 44 years. 44 years trapped inside, denying him really who he really was. Oh, jeez, you know. I said, were you there when he died? Do you remember anything at all? They wouldn't let me, he said. Funeral? No. As you know where your daddy's buried? He said, in Pennsylvania. And I said, Jerry, let me be your daddy for a minute. Just let me be your daddy for a minute and talk to me. What would you say to me? And he said, well, I'd say, no, you're talking to the wall. I mean, talk to me. Because I love you. I didn't need to go. And then it started. I mean, all of this. And the irrational. Why did you leave me? Why did God take you away? What did I do wrong? You know what I mean? All that stuff was pouring out. And it went on for perhaps too long. And finally, there's that moment of, you know, that recuperation and the light. There's a light there. And I said, Jerry, you can be really upset with me for that, or understand that I did it only because I love you, and something has to be done. And he's, no, I haven't felt this good in a long time. And so we talked a while longer, and I got him to write me some letters, and I responded as his dad. He agreed to visit the gravesite. He did some exercises, some of which we'll be talking about. And within, I'd say, 6 weeks, Jerry was a superstar. As he had caught his momentum, his power, and he was doing an outstanding job. And so that's why we talk about these things. That's why we talk about these things. You see, something has to occur that causes this to happen. And it's the ceremony that has evolved over the centuries, the eons, if you would, as to the proper way to do this. And in the next show, we're going to get into some things that, when we are in command, when we have the possibility of doing things a certain way, I'm going to make some recommendations. And the good news, however, is that if it's too late, like it was with my dad, the mind can still manage it if you have the right tools. The mind can still take care of it, and you can really, really be free. But this has been Life Talk, and we talk about life, living, and making a living. And one of the 3 reasons I'm delving into this, that the poets and the philosophers and the theologians have been saying for centuries, that unless we're comfortable with death and dying, we will never be comfortable with life and living. And so this is what we're about. We want people to reach their fullest, and to do that, they have to be able to embrace this concept, this idea, and to not ignore it, because it's an essential part of us. This is Life Talk, and my name is Bern, and it's
Moses.
Thank you, Gina.
Thank you, Bern. It's
We'll talk
been
next
wonderful.
week.